This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 409, Data Lakes. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we are talking about data lakes with Melissa Bent and April Sides. Melissa is a self-taught web developer specializing in configuring Drupal for large integrated systems. She started building websites in 1996, getting into Drupal in 2006, and is now a senior software engineer at Red Hat, leading the Drupal portions of their customer portal. She currently resides in Nampa, Idaho, on a small farm she owns with her parents, and collects plants, Lego, and various IoT and other practical DIY tech projects. Melissa, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
April is a back-end developer for developers.redhat.com, cloud.redhat.com, and, hard to say, kubernetesbyexample.com. She is also heavily involved in Drupal Camp Asheville. Thank you for that. The Ally Talks virtual meetup, and the Drupal Community Working Group Community Health Team. She is based in Asheville, North Carolina, and is also into Lego and Harry Potter. April, welcome to the show. Again, welcome back to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
I know, listeners, that you're thinking, hey, 2 Lego guests with Nick, and I understand Tim likes a little bit of Lego too. We're probably going to spend a lot of time talking about Lego today. So brace yourselves. It should be fun. For those of you that don't know or haven't listened before, I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM. And today, as I alluded to, joining me for his second week is Tim Plunkett, Engineering Manager at Acquia. Tim, welcome.
Yep. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So if you are signed up for our newsletter in the newsletter for episode 408, you can learn a little bit more about Tim in 5 Questions with Tim. And you can find out if Tim prefers plain or peanut M&Ms. I'm really hoping it's peanut M&Ms so that we have that in common, but don't tell anybody. They have to read the newsletter to find out.
No spoilers.
Perfect. And joining us as usual, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Hello, Nick.
Happy to be here.
And now, to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. This week, I thought we would talk about the Tagify module, which provides an entity reference widget that's more user-friendly. So it has the selections visually styled as tags without showing the reference ID. You can drag to sort and sort of a variety of other features. It's a module that was created in March of 2022. It has a 1.0.19 version, which works with Drupal 8.8 or newer, including Drupal 9 and 10. It is actively maintained. In fact, the latest release was pushed out in just the past week. And in terms of open issues, it only has 4 open issues, and only one of those is a bug. And it does also include test coverage in the module. Now, it's a module that is currently in use by 177 sites. The maintainer is GX Liano, who is David Galliano, a person that I actually got to meet in person at Drupal Dev Days last week. Now, Tagify is actually a popular JavaScript library, so it's in use by a lot more sites than just that Drupal number. And the module then is really just a Drupal integration for that library. Features that you get with the module include deactivating labels when the field's maximum number of entries have been reached, allowing the creation of new tags when the field has been configured to allow that, and so on. Now, it will also disallow duplicate tags automatically. And it also has a user list submodule specifically for user reference fields, which will also show the user's profile pic in the tag that it generates. The project page also, as sort of a handy reference, has animated GIFs that sort of demonstrate a lot of these capabilities. So it's definitely worth checking that out. I'll also add that this is a module I started using on my own blog a few months ago and find that it provides a really nice and simple user experience. So I could also see that drag to sort capability being really useful. For example, if you were using, the first term in a reference field as part of your path auto pattern. So that being said, let's open it up to discussion about the Tagify module.
So I'm gonna be Debbie Downer here and ask the first question. Does it, if for some reason JavaScript is blocked or disabled, does it have like a reasonable fallback, or does it just fall back to default Drupal?
That's an excellent question. I will confess I have not tested that, but maybe one of our listeners can chime into the Talking Drupal Slack channel and let us know.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either, but I actually have used this module. I cannot remember which project it was on, but I remember installing it, I think sometime last year. It was easy to configure, and I think pretty intuitive for clients. I think one of the things that it there's two things I think that it provides that users are starting to get used to on other projects that makes it kind of seem a little snappier, and that is when the styling of the tags, like you get that little box with the X next to it. And I think people are starting to get used to that. I don't even think the client that I installed it for, I'm gonna have to find out who it was. But I don't think they even use the drag and drop all that much, because most of my clients with tagging systems, order doesn't really matter. It's more of like, is it tagged or not? So I don't think they use that functionality, but yeah, it was pretty neat little module, pretty easy to work with.
Yeah, I've also used it, and I think, I don't know, I just like the UX benefits are definitely a big win. So I recommend that. And as Martin did say, if anybody has tried it without JS, I'd be interested to know if and how that works.
I have to say, non-Tagify thing that I noticed today. I was comparing a couple of other modules for allowing users to log in by email. And I'm curious if anybody else has had this. While I was evaluating them, I heard Martin's voice in the back of my mind, looking at this module has 5,000 users and 3 open issues, 2 of which are bugs. So you've definitely changed how I evaluate modules. So I appreciate that. Actually helped me make a selection today.
I will say I have many voices in my head, but Martin's is not often one of them.
I think something I like about this, at least from the screenshots, because I've never used this one. I think the more you work with Drupal, this is a common problem that people try to solve, is to make tagging easier to use without having to resort to the multi-value Drupal individual field for each thing. I've never seen one that allows you to edit, click to edit a term that you've already entered.
Oh, I didn't even notice that.
A pretty cool option, because what if you just misspelled a tag and you're like, oh no, but I already entered it, or whatever. That's kind of cool. I've never seen that.
So is it just me, or does an animated GIF on a module page sell a module way better than just regular images? Right? Tim's giving me the thumbs up.
Absolutely.
Anytime I see an animated GIF, I'm like, all right, we're doing it. We're putting it in there. It could be the most ridiculous thing, but it just gets me going.
I mean, going off on that tangent, I actually learned recently that you can make animated GIFs using Keynote on Macs pretty efficiently. So I can drop a tutorial about that in the show notes.
So along those same lines, another tool that you can use is Giphy actually has a tool that you can download. I had to make an animated GIF for something last week, and I was able to download it, I think, from the App Store and install it, and it worked pretty well. Captured what it was supposed to capture and allowed me to kind of resize it a little bit too. So there you go. Not only is it a module of the week, but we're also giving you ways to make animated GIFs.
I would be curious to know the accessibility of this form. It looks really cool, but I don't know. Be interesting to know about that.
I will also add that I've been on projects where the customer really wanted to remove the numbers and brackets after an standard entity reference field, and the fact that this does this is, I think, also adds to the user experience as well.
I feel like we could have a whole podcast about that one. Like that was the one thing that they were like, nope, simply cannot launch this site until those numbers are gone from that field. I'd be interested to hear more about that at a later date. All right. Well, Martin, as usual, thank you for bringing us a wonderful module of the week, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thanks, John. See you then.
All righty. Let's move on to our primary topic, which is talking about data lakes. I'm going to try not to make any of the dumb dad jokes about like, it's summertime, let's go to the data lake. Oh, there I go. I just did it. All right, let's start with hopefully an easy question. What is a data lake?
I would say a data lake is a raw and flexible data store with schema on read capabilities.
Oh boy.
A neat fun fact, something that I just looked up today, is the history of it is that I guess why it's called a data lake is because it came out whenever Apache Hadoop, I guess that's how you pronounce it, HADOOP, had the yellow elephant logo. And it was something about the yellow elephant and the watering holes. I thought that was interesting. I didn't know about that before this podcast. But yeah, that's why it's called a data lake.
You said schema on read. So does that mean like only NoSQL data lakes can only be NoSQL type databases, or
it's not a relational database. Yeah, it's not a relational database. The way that we're using it, though, we are defining schema as we're indexing content, and we can get into that later when we're talking about how we're using it. So it's not that you can't put a schema on it when you're indexing, putting data into it. You can also do a schema on read. I don't know. I'm not really sure how that piece would work. It's not part of what we've been working with, but it's interesting, an interesting feature of a data lake.
So at its core, I guess it's a set of data, right? And a schema to basically get to that data or use that data, right? If we like simplify it, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Beyond the standard, like when I first started using Drupal, I remember being like, how am I supposed to figure this out? I don't know. And then for whatever reason, it never dawned on me that I could like look at the database when I was like a new developer, because I'm a self-taught developer, right? So I was just like figuring things out as I went. And I mean, the things that I did when I did migrations, you don't even want to know how much I used Excel to import things. Like I didn't know about auto incrementing IDs or any of those things. Like to my shame, the first Drupal site I ever built, the auto increment IDs were off and the revision IDs were off by 1 because I like didn't do my auto population in Excel properly. So for like the rest of the life of that site, they were always off by 1 because we didn't have revisioning on. Anyway, like that kind of stuff. Like if you look at the database of Drupal now, right, we get comfortable with that concept. And I know that there are different backends people use with Drupal, but the most common one is MySQL, MySQL. Again, I don't hear these things spoken aloud often. I read them a lot, but the difference here, the main difference here is that it's very flexible and it doesn't really care about how you put it in. It just says it's here, right? Versus it being very opinionated about this has to be this. Like it's not typed. Like you don't have to say this is this long and it has to be an integer. Like it doesn't care about that kind of stuff. It just says here's your data.
I think one of the other key features of it too is you can source from multiple places, so they don't all have to match. Like if you have one primary source that has, IDs that are alphabetized and another one that has them that are numerical, and even if they conflict, you can put all those in the data lake and access them separately or together. It's just basically as the information comes in, it gets stored. It doesn't matter what that information is or how it's formatted. It means that putting information into it is very easy. Sometimes pulling information out can be a little bit more complex because you have to end up, it puts a lot of that validation on, either the application or some layer between the data lake and the application. but it makes it very easy to just ingest data, I think.
Yep. Yeah.
How would something like this compare to something like a NoSQL database like Mongo?
So we actually are using Mongo for as our So but it's actually very similar, and well, I mean, because you can use different types of backends for data lakes, but the concept is almost exactly the same. And for us, it's exactly exactly the same. Yeah.
So how, I'm curious obviously about Red Hat in particular, but how do organizations typically use a data lake, and maybe how is Red Hat using it for your project specifically?
So I'd say for us, one of the ways that we use it is to, let's say the reason that we use it. So the reason that it came up as a topic is because we have so many different systems that need to be separate for various reasons, whether it's this team has their own system, we have ours, whether it's like we think in Drupal because we're building in Drupal most of the time, but we have other teams that are building in like a homegrown solution, or they have a completely JavaScript application that they've built that they're using Mongo as a backend, possibly for their entire application. So we have all these different technologies. The thing that ends up happening is you get, because you have all these different reasons for these systems, but you need them to be able to talk to each other or have other systems use their data. That's where the data lake comes in and is really, really valuable, because it becomes, April, that's such a great thing that you thought of, that you found the watering hole. Like they all come together in one place. They might have various backgrounds or various different needs, but in the end, they're all coming to the same place to get data.
All your website animals come to the same watering hole.
Exactly. Yeah, and that really helps with like making sure your data is consistent, right? So if we, Red Hat is a product company, we want to make sure our product information is accurate across all of these different pieces of the ecosystem. Having it in one place and having it edited like by a single source, then it should be more consistent. It shouldn't be a manual process to make things consistent across the ecosystem.
So that raises a little bit of a question for me, and maybe we'll talk about this in how Red Hat is specifically using a data lake. But I wonder if it's a central place for data, right? And that schema is being applied typically when the data is being read. Who can write the data, right, to that data lake, and then is there a schema that needs to be applied there as to how they're writing it?
Well, the data lake is definitely bring your own governance, right? You have to provide all those things. And so for my use case, we don't have a single source. We have multiple sites. We're using it for learning paths. So like being able to index data that can be a part of a learning path, which is just a collection of like information to help you learn about a topic or product or something like that. We just wanted it to have like basically a pool or a lake of resources that you could choose from different sites. And so the way that we are making sure that the data is what we expect is that we have a shared module that's installed on the Drupal sites that are currently using this. And right now it's developers.redhat.com and cloud.redhat.com. And so the module contains the schema. And so when we're indexing, the schema is followed, and the shared module has all this, similar ways of retrieving the data, and it should act in similar ways. We have all those expectations sort of baked into the shared module, specific to learning paths. And then Melissa created an indexing module, which I think that's the one that you shared as a sandbox project, right, on Drupal.org. So I'll let her talk a little bit about how we're indexing data, because it's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it's actually internally, it's called Red Hat Index because we already had a Red Hat search module, and naming things. So Red Hat Index it is. But it basically it integrates with Search API. So because Search API already has a lot of those things figured out, and I thought, I don't want to have to rebuild this from scratch, and I shouldn't have to. Open source, yay, right? So basically, we built on top of Search API, and there are a couple of little gotchas in there, like at least the way that we're using it, and I haven't had time to figure out why or to work around it, but it expects, if you're using the UI, to map your incoming values. If you wanted to define your schema directly through the Search API interface, it requires all the keys are lowercase, and our team wanted them to be camel case. So I actually do a transform in my event subscriber that formats them the way we want. It's really simple. It's like strip out the underscores, and wherever you see an underscore, make it camel case instead, and it works. It's fine. So it's not a big deal. It's just like the little gotchas that you find when you're working with it. And initially I was making them all like standard, lowercase underscores, kind of like a very Drupal approach to things. But our team, they are not Drupal people who handle our GraphQL layer that sits on top of the data lake for extraction of data. They were just like, why does it look like this? And I was like, because. And they were like, can it be camel case? I'm like, yes, it can. So I made it.
Hopefully that's well documented somewhere.
Yeah. So I have it. I in the Red Hat Index module that I made, I have like a sample event subscriber with like basically lots of comments in there about why I did what I did and why things are happening. We also have sample schemas. We have like a Google like spreadsheet that we use for when we onboard new projects into the data lake, because it's small right now. So it's a lot of ad hoc stuff going on because we just launched the data lake architecture like late last year. We just launched production values using it earlier this year. And like April, I think Learning Paths, when was that launched? Was that launched earlier this year or was it late last year?
On developers, it launched, I think in fall, I think in September of last year. And then we integrated with cloud this year.
The best thing about this is that I was doing all this documentation and building and everything like that. And she launched hers before I got to launch mine. So she actually used all the work that I shouldn't say that. I'm not saying she didn't do any work. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is she used the groundwork that I laid, put her implementation on top of it, and actually launched hers to production before mine actually got out the door. But it was really great to see it in use early on. So, but yeah, we have to actually define the schema. And the way I did it was through an event subscriber that I trigger through my custom Red Hat Index module. And it triggers the event subscriber right before it goes out the door, right before it goes to Mongo. And it lets you do basically whatever you want, whatever massaging to the data. Because I think we all are experienced enough with Drupal to know that if you're too opinionated, then you end up finding a use case that you're just fighting against Drupal the whole time. And I didn't want that to happen because I didn't know how people were going to use it. So I was like, I'm just going to make it very basic so that we can just get it out the door.
Makes sense. So I'm curious, a little bit more curious about the Drupal integration side then. So it sounds like you kind of use Search API to kind of feed information into it, but are you also pulling information out of the data lake for Drupal? And how does that work? Is it Fuse, custom integration? How's that work?
Yeah, so that was a task to figure out how to get the data out of Mongo. At the time, so Melissa's work was they were working on GraphQL integration as well. So a GraphQL layer on top of MongoDB to do all your queries. And then her information was going to be in sort of single page apps. So not specifically in Drupal. And so we created basically a base service that can query MongoDB directly using the PHP MongoDB drivers. And so we have a way to do the queries like find and find one, I think are the two that we're using. And then, we are, I think, what was there's a module that I was using. Oh, I'm not going to remember what it is. It was external data source. So that allows us to query MongoDB using the PHP MongoDB driver and do an autocomplete field. So when they're we're creating basically a resource container so that they can add extra information to it. They can tag it for their particular site. They can add a little extra data. And so we have a node or a content type called a resource, and that has a text field that will hold a unique identifier that is in MongoDB for that resource in the data lake. So this external data source module allows us to query and do an autocomplete thing. It's a little hacky. Whenever you select the title or whatever, you can search by title and you can see what site the information is coming from. And once you select it, it just drops that UUID in there. We need a more robust system so that people can tell like what resource is being referenced here. So we'll do some iterations there, but that was a pretty lightweight way to get that data and make those connections and get those UUIDs set up so that when you view the resource, then either as standalone, which is more for editing purposes, we're more showing it in the context of a learning path. So we have like the hero in the sidebar and then previous next buttons and things like that. When it's displayed, it's pulling all the data, like the image. If you go to the website and check out any of the learning paths on developers or cloud, it's pulling a little image. It's creating a button. It's pulling all the page text maybe from an article or something like that. That's all being shown from the data lake, but it's being pulled in and put into the pre-process. So like we do the query for that UUID, we add it to the render array, and then our templates know what to do. We can do whatever we want with that data and render it out per site, however that site wants to show that data.
One of the things that I'm working on right now, I actually just had a meeting about it yesterday, and I mentioned it in the DrupalCon talk we did, is like shared content, or like I was calling it content syndication, but that sounds like RSS feeds, which is not what it is. But actually, Tim, it's using Layout Builder to build content. Hey, yeah, we have a module called Pattern Kit, which is on Drupal.org. Yes, so it sits on top of that. So you can apply patterns to your output. And then what we're doing is we're actually, what we will be doing, this is what I have to do in the next sprint or two, is to do this for our product implementation, is to basically make it so that people can build like CTAs or bands or whatever in the middle of the content. And then they'll build it, it'll index it into the data lake fully rendered. It's like all the HTML will be there, and then we'll have metadata attached to it about like what product it's associated with, whatever metadata needs to go into it, because schema. So we'll put that in the schema. And then what that allows us to do is when my front-end developer does his GraphQL query, he'll do it against this part of the data lake, and it'll pull in all of the appropriate pieces of content that go with it and inject them into the page. And then with Drupal, you can use like scheduler. Yep. So then our content editors don't even have to touch anything on the front end at all. They can actually like schedule the content, get all their stuff ready to go. If there's an event, if there's something they're trying to push, whatever, it stores the fully rendered layout builder driven work, and actually just injects it at render time, which for my application it's a statically generated page. So we have a pipeline that statically generates the pages and then shows them.
So this show is gonna pair well with our episode 2 episodes ago, 407, where we talked about Drupal search in quite a bit depth. But just so you know, Melissa, there's a core bug currently with Search API. I think it's also in Search API, but when you are indexing rendered content, BigPipe, there's some conflict with sessions being started out of sync and headers being sent previously. I'll link them in the show notes again, since I just mentioned it again. But you might run into some issues with indexing rendered content, your logs are going to fill up pretty quickly.
Good to know.
So I'll link those, but yeah, it's an ongoing issue
Thanks.
right now. I think it might be more prevalent in 10.1 because it started happening on a site that upgraded to 10.1.
With the sounds like you definitely have the output side of it, lined up pretty great. How is the experience of getting things into the lake? What is that process like, and how does it actually work?
For my side, it's automatic. It's just like a search index. So
Right. Well, no,
like
I mean,
with
I guess
Solar, yeah.
Right, but what exactly can you? I mean, without what can you describe? I mean, April
Right.
mentioned what the kinds of things that are being put in there, but like, how are they being generated? Like, where are they coming from? Really?
Right. So right now it's Drupal centric.
Yeah.
So all of our content in the data lake that we have today is coming from a Drupal source.
Makes sense. Okay.
In the future, as we onboard more projects, we'll have alternate sources coming in.
Gotcha.
Because we do have other systems within Red Hat that want to utilize this ecosystem. But we're starting off with Drupal because that's what we work in, but also because we have the shared module ready.
Of course.
So yeah.
So right now it's an abstraction layer that may or may not need to be there because it's all Drupal, but it then allows you to do all these other things in the future and move away from that.
Right.
Drupal as the only type of canonical backend. All right, that sounds awesome. Yeah.
I actually called it at DrupalCon. I called it basically our presentation layer for our product site, because the product site actually has the Drupal instance doesn't actually have a public facing URL at all.
Right.
It's literally it's
store.
decoupled. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
the content store, and it handles the permissions, all of the admin aspects of the content are stored and handled by Drupal.
Right.
But the rendering portion is basically the actual schema, like the JSON object that has the schema applied and pushed into the data lake.
And I don't think you've said, Melissa, what your use case is. You're doing product data in particular, right?
Yeah, that's like, I started at Red Hat in April of 2020. Oh my gosh, how long has it been? I think 2020. I don't know. It's been a long time. 2021, whatever. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So it's been like over 2 years that I've been working on this particular data set, because it's something it's the classic thing where the need outpaced the architecture, where everybody needed something now or needed something today, and they did what was necessary for their application. And then now we're having to go back and build something that standardizes the approach, which is just always takes longer. Yeah. And so we're having almost weekly meetings about this still, trying to standardize some of this approach. But the data lake approach that I generated was basically my way of, well, here we are. We have this available as a possibility. If you guys, if we don't agree on that being the data source, then we will then instead generate or ingest an ID from them. Because the idea that the biggest idea that I had was to have a single ID for products. So that way, when we're doing these kinds of matches between our various systems, that we know what we're talking about. Because if you just do name matches, it's not good enough. Everyone knows that a name can change. It just doesn't work consistently. So that's the kind of concept that we're working through right now. But yeah, that I was working with product data. We basically took over access.redhat.com/products. So everything after that subpath is running off of our data lake data, and it's all statically generated on, like I said, through a pipeline. Our front end developer does a query against our GraphQL endpoint, pulls the data in, builds it in a Nuxt application, generates static pages, and presents it. So that's constantly being iterated upon as we go. The next thing, like I said, is going to be those kind of inline it's not ads. It's more like call outs, right? Just to like, hey, there's this new thing, whatever. So much of our front end needs to be dynamic. And as much as Drupal, I mean, Drupal can do amazingly powerful things. All the different things that we're pulling from, it made sense to use a decoupled approach for us. I know decoupled is kind of like there's people who are like, why are you using it? Should we use it? And you should absolutely ask those questions. For us, it was yes. But it's not yes for everybody. And it shouldn't be yes for everybody, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So one question that keeps coming to my mind as I'm hearing you talk about this is, like, you have this data lake, data goes into it from various sources, data comes out of it to various sources, right? And this question is kind of like a two-parter, I guess. Like, I'm wondering how you make changes to the data lake, right? So I'm imagining like, hey, there needs to be a schema update to the data lake for some reason, right? So like, and when I say changes, like changes to like the schema of the data lake, but also changes to maybe certain types of data that are stored within it. So like thinking like bulk updates, syncing of similar data that's been entered from multiple sources, that sort of thing. Like, so let's break it down a little bit. Let's first ask the question of like, how do you make changes to like the schema of the data lake for, you know, future enhancements or because you realize that change is needed?
April, you
Go,
want to
April.
take that? I think you're smiling
Sure.
harder.
Yeah.
So
We both unmuted
actually
at the same time.
I was actually gauging who was smiling harder to figure out who I was going to pick on. But
This is how April and I fight. We're like,
That's it.
no, we
Yeah.
don't fight. It's a smile battle.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's where the power of Search API comes into play, where you can queue all of your content up for reindexing. You can clear the data from the site, or through Search API, you can clear the data in the data lake for a particular site and then reindex everything. Like, I think that really the ability to like not have stale data or have data rot in the data lake is because we're using Search API, because we have those tools that are built in with that contrib module. That just makes it a lot easier to make those updates. I mean, yeah, if you start getting lots of data and you have to index all of it, and if we're seeing the problem that Nick has just mentioned about Search API and all of that, which may be a problem that we found today, and so I'm gonna have to check out that link that you have. But yeah, like just being able to use those tools that already exist has been amazing.
Real-time problem solving. One thing
Yeah.
I just want to expand on there, and then I'll let you jump in, Nick. But so all the sites are using that module. So you actually have the ability, if there needs to be some sort of like systemic change, to run update hooks and kind of do that stuff at the Drupal level, right? So
Yeah.
that makes a lot more sense to me now. And as to like, that's one stop basically for everybody to connect to the data lake. Nick, what were you going to say?
yeah, so it sounds to me like that's kind of a standard process for you because you have just one single source right now. So if you wanted to change the way you're formatting dates, for example, for whatever reason, you know, you would just update that on the Search API side, reindex, and you'd be done. So it sounds like you really haven't crossed the bridge yet where another source is entering data that may be modifying existing data, like appending additional information to an index or actually not an index, but to a record or something. And it's because that's where it really gets complex. Like if you have two sources, source A creates the thing and then source B modifies that, and then you need to kind of change how that works.
Yeah.
Depending on the
So all
size
of
the data
ours,
lake.
yeah, all of our data has like, it has an origin, like it knows what site it came from, one. So if
Okay.
there is duplicate data on the two sites right now that are using it, then it's going to be duplicated in the system. It just is, you know, the nature of it. And so, yeah, so like, so each site has its own ID. It's not going to blow away other, like if I reindex cloud, it's not going to blow away the data for developers and vice versa. Like it's site specific. And so I think really we're kind of using this shared module as our governance, right? So you have to use the shared module. You have to have the same schema. And if we make an update, it's going to affect all the sites that are using it, and being able to manage that. Right now, we just have the 2 sites. And so we haven't had a ton of managing of that. But yeah.
There's no shared data there, it sounds like, right? So it's not like 2 sites are using one data item from the lake, right?
Right. We have multiple data sources that are feeding in, but they are not overlapping. They're not editing same data. Yeah. I think that would be a bad.
Yeah.
That would be a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, we're not going from many to many for sure. Yeah. We don't want to have to solve that problem. But one thing April brought up, which I think is really a cool addition that she actually added into the Red Hat Index module itself, was this idea of actually using an internal. We have all of our sites have IDs internally, and so we actually use that as the hash. So Search API has a hash value that lets you determine like where like something came from. So we use that as the hash, and that's when you clear when you use Search API to clear an index, it keys it by that hash so that it doesn't accidentally do everybody's. And that's what April did, because I didn't think of it. And when she cleared the index, she cleared all my data out at one point. And I was like, oh, thanks, April. Well, you said
I did it more because I did it more because we have like our dev and our stage and our prod and our locals. And if we're connecting to this data, we pull down a prod database and the hash value is different than our local, then they're not going to find the data. So it had to be a common hash for the site so that at all these different levels, the data would be found. It would be the same IDs or whatever. Like that was the origin of the site.
It was a good addition.
Your stuff is in a separate collection. That's another thing about this, is that we each have our own collection. It's the same MongoDB database, but I have a collection for learning paths and she has a collection for products. And so you can connect. My understanding is that we're connecting to our collection and not overlapping or touching each other's stuff.
Yeah. So technically you can do them into the same collection. And actually my initial view of it was that we were going to use the same collection for everything. But then there's a question of like permissions, and you have write permissions to different things, and like how much do you trust your colleagues aren't going to overwrite your stuff and destroy everything when they have full rights to write everything. And we were just like, trust but verify. So we're going to go ahead and have collections to separate that out. But one thing, John, that you brought up about schema, about updates, we do have this idea of primary data within every schema that we generate. So primary data is going to be the shared data that's shared across every record, not meaning the content itself, but meaning the keyed values. So like UUID, created date, updated date, system or source system, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Those are every record in the data lake has to have that. And then everything else after that is where deviation's allowed. So for your implementation. So if we decide to add new primary key values, that's not primary key. That means something else. Primary data values you want to track, that's where the shared module will be useful, because then we can tell it to pull that in.
That brings up a question for me, Melissa, then. It sounds like you have different collections, so you can kind of manage your own, I guess, domains and indexes. But who's in charge of Mongo itself?
Not me, which was actually a goal of mine, because as I told my colleagues here, I was like, I don't want to be the DevOps person for this. Like I've worked in IT before. Before I was a web developer, I was in IT for a number of years, and I'm like, I don't want to do that again. I don't want the on-call like 3 a.m. call because something's down or whatever. So one of the things we actually worked out beforehand, very early on, was who's in charge of this, who's on pager duty, who's, and so there's actually an infra team here who's in charge of keeping our Mongo instance up and running. And they have people like on call, because international, right? So Red Hat's a large place, so they kind of like hand off who's in charge of it. Yeah. So that it doesn't have to be me, which was my main goal.
It's a good goal, honestly. So I asked this in all seriousness, but how big does the lake have to be a lake and not a pond or something else? Like, when does it start? Is it just
a puddle?
A puddle, a data puddle.
I would consider right now it's more like a data pond. But in all actuality, I don't think it's a question of the size. It's more of the intent. So as long as the architecture is set up in such a way that, like as we've described with not opinionated, the schema is at least for us is being applied as it goes in. It's a very light administrative side of things. Like, it's not trying to tell you what to do, basically. Like, as long as those things are in place, then you have a data lake. Like, you could have one on your local.
Yeah.
And
so it's more about the approach, the methodology, and making sure it can scale to be a data ocean. But
exactly.
Right. I was going to say the scalability. It's scalable.
Really makes sense.
When we need it to be scalable.
Something I brought up at the talk as well was that it's just this give and take thing where it introduces a single point of failure for all your data, which can be scary, but it also means if something goes wrong, you only have one place to look. You don't have to look at all these different places where things could go wrong. So it simplifies the troubleshooting process by quite a bit, because the architecture itself is very simple. It's a MongoDB with data in it. So when it comes down to troubleshooting issues, it simplifies the process quite a bit.
It also means if a source goes down, the sources reading the destinations reading the data don't go down, right? So if you have an older legacy system that's kind of fragile, goes down all the time, it just needs to be up as long as people are editing content and indexing content, right?
Yep.
You can kind of use the data lake as a temporary cache of the data.
And it acts as a caching layer. The other thing it can do as well, since at least in my instance, my Drupal instance isn't serving traffic. So resource-wise, we can scale the resourcing for it to be very small, because we don't need it to handle incoming traffic. So it can actually, in some ways, if you have these lots of data sources putting data in, it can save you on infra costs, possibly, which could be really cool. But infra costs, like, it's the black hole of operational expenditures. I mean, how many of us, when we were testing, have left a server running? Because I did on AWS. They give you a one-time refund.
Oopsie card.
Yeah, one-time oopsie card, which I've already cashed in.
So my next question is about modules, but I keep coming back to this thought in my head, and I wanna ask about it. So bear with me, because it's going to be a dumb question. Earlier on, Nick talked about our search show, and on that search show, we talked about Solar, and Solar kind of has like the same idea, right? It's like a search server, right, that has cores that are the different kind of like buckets of data, right? So it sounds very similar to what is happening for you guys in Mongo. I'm wondering if we can kind of just talk about the differences there, right? So obviously Solar is like more of a search appliance. It's very heavily used for like searching as a search utility. Is the main difference, I guess, in like a data lake versus like Solar sort of search index, the fact that like multiple systems could get that data out of the data lake, as opposed to not maybe being able to do that in kind of like a Solar configuration? And Tim or Nick, if this is like a totally dumb question, you can just be like, yo, man, you're an idiot. Bam. Feel free.
So I asked the same question when we were
I'm
talking
not
about data lakes.
an idiot.
It was really funny because I'm like, I actually have a friend who ran, I think it's the crazycouponlady.com website for a long time. And they actually were like indexing WordPress into Solr and using a decoupled front end to pull all their content from Solr. So it's actually, I was like, why can't you just use Solr, instead? But the problem, I think, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but well, first off, we actually, within Red Hat, we have a very strong Solr team, infra team already. And they manage a lot of our like search connectivity between all of our different applications, because we also have different search collections for like Solr indexing and all that stuff. Like, it's very complicated. So I was like, why can't we just use that? And the first answer I got was because, and I didn't think that was good enough.
Seems reasonable.
So I asked the same question, and I think that the thing that came down to was we wanted to be able to iterate quickly. That was one reason. And with Mongo, you can just stand up a collection, you can index straight into it. It's very fast, at least like from an IT perspective internally, it was faster. But I was like, that's kind of still not good enough if you want to. Like, that shouldn't be a good enough reason to not use the best idea. But I think it was what it came down to was the flexibility of the schema. And Solr puts, I don't know, it's,
hey, listen,
it is very, very,
you
very
had
simple.
me at flexibility. Like, I'm a big fan of, like, Solr's not as flexible. Like, Solr is a search utility.
It's made for one thing.
Right,
it really is made for that. And also I've heard situations, at least in the past, where if something goes down, they have to re-index it, and it can take a really long time to do that. But I remember from that website, that my friend who was doing the Crazy Coupon Lady website, just the number of times that their Solr index would go down, and then their whole site would go down, and all this like crazy stuff. And it's like, well, let's go for the simple approach that gives us the flexibility we need. We don't need all the overhead of what Solr applies.
Thanks for indulging
And
my.
I think
it
you
was
also
slower,
mentioned.
too.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned at one point that Solr is more opinionated, I guess, maybe as far as schema, or something like that, than MongoDB would be. So that was another.
And MongoDB was faster as well for what we were doing.
Got it.
I think some of it too is a lot of times with these larger organizations, especially if they have a dedicated team for something, that team is going to have a lot of opinions. And if you need to deviate from those, and they're usually there for a good reason, right? But if you're doing something new and you're trying to deviate or form a new opinion, there's a lot of institutional momentum there. So sometimes going out into a new technology, it is worthwhile. And I mean, Solr's mature. It's been around forever, though. I mean, Mongo is mature at this point too, but it's also newer, so it handles certain situations differently, and it sounds like it's a better fit for you guys.
So I appreciate everybody indulging my dumb question. Turns out it may not have been as dumb as I thought it was. My original question, and I think you've kind of already elaborated on this, I just want to double check that we covered everything here. I'm wondering what Drupal modules are you using, right? So you're using, based on our conversation, you're using a custom module that like all the sites are using, right? And then external data sources. Are there any other modules that are kind of like integral to like the connection to the data lake, or are those two pretty much it?
As far as getting the data in and out, those are pretty much it. And we have, obviously the dependency on Search API with our homegrown module.
Sure.
There's also a MongoDB module that provides some connectivity that we're using. And then as far as learning paths, we're using the allow only one module to make sure that our Drupal site isn't referencing, doesn't have duplicate references for resources in the data lake. So there's a one-to-one if you're referencing an article on another site, there's only one resource that is referencing that article within the site that you're working in. Otherwise, it could get a little wild.
Allow only one. Is that not for a content type? Can you set it to like allow for a certain field type? How does that?
Yeah, I think
work?
we're doing it on ID. So we were going to do it by title, but another module we're using on the learning path stuff is the automatic entity label. Automatic entity label.
Got it.
So it will pull, it allows us to create, we created a custom token, I believe is how it works, that has the data lake title, the resource title in the data lake, and that just gets populated whenever the node is saved or created. And then we tried to allow only one based on title and the unique identifier from the data lake. And because I think it had something to do with when you create the first node or something, it looked at the token. There was some probably order of operations issue where it didn't quite get the title that you wanted. It was looking at the token.
Mm-hmm.
So we just ended up, it doesn't matter. We're doing it by the the ID. That is the unique identifier. So that really is what's gonna keep us from having multiple references.
Got it.
We're also using Entity Browser. I'm trying to think. I think that's for our resources. We can actually, since we're injecting the data lake data in a pre-processed hook, we can do any view of the resource can include data lake data. So we can do like a view that shows cards of the different resources as well. So I think that's when the resource is being added to a learning path. So you've created your resources. It's your resource. It's referencing the data in the data lake. Then you want to add that resource to the learning path. That's just like an entity reference field that has, drag and drop ordering. We're using Entity Browser to then display card views of those things that already exist, or you can click the tab to create a new one while you're creating the learning path and that sort of thing. So those are pretty handy. And then I think as far as we've been talking about this index module that we share locally. In our talk, Melissa put a sandbox project up that's MongoDB Data Lake. We can share that link. And maybe I was thinking maybe I should put my the service class I was talking about, how I retrieve data in Drupal. Maybe I should add that to that module so it's available for people to play around with it as well.
You are a maintainer.
I am a maintainer.
She's like, thanks a lot, Melissa. I was like, you're welcome.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, April's
Did you have something to add?
implementation is, I was just going to say that April's implementation is very much, is so different from mine, which is, I think, such a good example of how this can be used, right? Sure, hers is very integrated with Drupal, and mine is using Drupal for the actual data management, and then the presentation something else. So mine is actually very light, but one thing we are doing is translation as well. So we actually have translations going in, and that's using mostly Drupal core, content translation work. But pretty soon we will be using Layout Builder once the new feature that I have to build gets to feature complete. So, but mine's very light by comparison. The rest of mine is mostly custom just because it has to be.
I think our future plans right now are going to include decoupled learning paths. So that's going to be interesting. That's going to go a little bit full circle, come back to the thing that you've been doing with products. We're going to be doing more with learning paths too. So that'll be an interesting thing to go through.
Awesome. So kind of the next question that I always have with these types of situations, right? You have multiple systems kind of managing their own collection of data, right? But then you have a bunch of people using that data. If you need to modify your collection, I think there's two parts to this question. First, how do you communicate to your users like, hey, we're going to change this date format, so be ready. And how do you coordinate the actual rollout of that change? maybe we can start with you, Melissa, because it sounds like you have a few more users that are a little bit more removed from the data, so the communication plays.
Yeah, generally, so that usually what I do, and this applies for APIs actually. I use the same mentality for both this kind of schema approach and APIs, because it's kind of a similar approach, except that we don't do versioning. Like with an API, you can say v2 and have them sit side by side. With this, technically you could, but what I've gone for so far is actually, if I need to change something and I'm going to deprecate a field, I will actually just add a new field with the format the way I want it to be. And then I'll give a lifetime for the old one and say, in whatever, 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, whatever, this will no longer be present. If you have a problem with that, reach out to us and let us know, and we'll coordinate, right? So that's basically how I do it. We have an email list of people who respond to us, but we also have Slack channels, which is, I think, more effective for us, where we'll do like an announcement in the Slack channel for people who are using our data lake data. And I'll just say, announcement on this day, you'll no longer be able to use this field, use this instead. And that seems to work really well. And again, there's usually not a reason to, at least in my mind, there's not necessarily a reason to overwrite something unless it's an integrated field. So if you have a field that like is used as like an ID field that's used as a key for something else, then that becomes a little more tricky.
Yep.
But I try not to touch ID fields because it's like, that's the whole point of an ID, is that it doesn't change. So yeah.
How about you, April? Anything different?
We haven't had a ton of schema changes yet to have to deal with that, so that's a good thing to bring up and bring to light. And our teams that are working on the 2 sites that are currently using it are the same team. And so if we know a schema change is coming up, we'll create tickets that will handle template changes and things like that to make sure that it all matches up. But that's a really good point, is how we can, I would think some sort of change log in Confluence and in our documentation will probably be really handy too, to let people know what to expect. We take advantage of, like, we like how Drupal deprecates things, or like there's all these schedules and things. I guess we have to, as part of our governance now, we got to come up with our own deprecation governance as a part of this.
Yep.
So that was a good point.
What I keep telling our users is that we are currently on the bleeding edge of technology when it comes to this feature. And so sometimes you get cut. I was actually just talking with someone on our design team, because she presented designs and they said, oh, well, we have to change this now. And she was like, this is the 3rd time. And I was like, that's what happens with bleeding edge. Like, it moves really, really fast. And even by like agency, like Drupal agencies standards, it moves really fast. Like from day to day, sometimes requirements will change, versus Red Hat standards, where sometimes corporations can take like, oh, that happens super fast. I'm like, it took us 3 months to do that. They're like, yeah, that was really fast. I'm like, what? So this kind of like iteration that we're working on right now, our schedule is really fast. So we have to be in constant communication with one another, or else it just doesn't work. And sometimes we have to redo stuff because we're figuring it out as we go.
Sounds good.
So you've mentioned a bunch of different, sandbox modules and other, offhand a bunch of modules here. What are any of the? What would be the number one sort of like gotcha or pro tip if for anyone trying to implement their own data lake for their own organization or product?
Do you need it? You have to have a really good use case for it, because it does take a lot of work to do. When you abstract data the way we're doing it, it automatically brings its own challenges, like the governance plan that April and I have been talking about this whole time. The fact that we have to have a governance plan,
right?
It's something that not everyone thinks about, you don't want to get into a ready, fire, aim situation where you like build something and then go, oh no, now people are using it. We can't change it anymore. Right. It's just, it has, I don't think the complexity is in the technology. Not really. The complexity is in the administration. And if you don't administrate it right from the very beginning, then you end up with just a lot of problems down the road. So I would say the number one question would be, do you need it? Yeah. Do you actually need it?
That's
and
great
if
advice,
you do,
honestly. Yeah.
then, be ready for the work.
Yeah, when we originally did the learning path stuff, it really felt like overkill because we were only doing it on one site. We were basically taking content on the same site, putting it in the data lake, and then referencing it back into the same site. So it was really complex for that, but the idea was setting the foundation for being able to add more sites to it and stuff like that. So yeah, it would have been easily solvable with just an entity reference if we weren't looking for that idea to share the data across different properties and different applications.
Just out of curiosity, on the governance note, who is managing that? Is that your team directly, or is there some sort of governance overlord that is determining that governance?
It's basically the data owners so far, because there's so few of us. Mm-hmm. As we expand, I have no doubt that it'll grow and we'll have more people, but it's basically myself, April, and a lady named Stacy, who's on our shared tooling team. So the three of us kind of collaborate together, and Stacy's like our advocate for when people want to start using the data lake, then she knows how to use it as well. So that way they don't have to track April and myself down if they don't need to. Then also, I don't want to be a single point of failure. April doesn't either. So, sure, the more people who know how to work with this, the better. So that's how we do it right now. And we're kind of because we're the ones using it and working with it, we're the authoritative source. But, we do collaborate a lot as well. So with one another and with our teams. So if that's not a situation that someone who's considering doing this, if they're not in that situation where they don't have that authority, then they need to get some sort of mandate from someone who has authority to give them that authority.
Right.
So people will listen to you. Otherwise, you end up with just a data lake full of stuff that doesn't look like it.
Like a data swamp.
Yeah. Hey! Yeah. Keeping it going.
Yeah.
Like it. Yeah.
Melissa, April, thank you for joining us. It has been a very enlightening conversation and full of great tips and tricks around data lakes.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter or X, I guess, for now. With the handle Talking Drupal. We'd really got to update this and figure out where we're going to live, because the weekly changes are
this is why we don't let Nick go off script.
Well, it's no longer called Twitter, I guess, officially. But anyway, you can also connect by email, which is more reliable, at show@talkingdrupal.com. And you can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
Which feels like the most reliable option if I had to choose. But anyway,
you're always there.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter. And as we mentioned, last week's edition has the questions with Tim.
I'm still thinking about those M&Ms. Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, we have reached the end of our show. This is the portion of the show where we allow for shameless self-promotion. Melissa, if folks wanted to talk about Red Hat, talk about data lakes, how best can they contact you to do that?
That is a great question. Probably email, honestly, to start with. I'm also on Drupal Slack. My is it handle? Is that what we call them still? Is that the thing?
Sure.
Is Meraluka, MERAULUKA. There's a long story behind that goes back to AOL. Enjoyed that story. But that's my handle on Drupal.org. You can reach out to me. I have all my contacts listed there, but also my email is mbent@redhat.com. That'll be fun. Please enjoy. Please don't spam me.
Just for nostalgia, you've got mail.
Oh, yay.
April, where can folks find you?
I am also on the Drupal Slack. My name is presented there, April Sides, but my handle is week before next, not the week after next, but the week before, which is now. I guess that's probably the best way to get in touch with me, really. I don't want spam.
That's all right. That's fair. Nobody converts the email addresses from audio to email to spam people. Tim, how can folks find you?
I'll say Drupal Slack as well, honestly.
All right. Yeah. Drupal Slack. Hey, listen, you could start a chat with all of us. It'll be fun. I can guarantee it. Nick Laughlin, how can our listeners get a hold of you?
Well, I'm at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Have a good one, everyone.